Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar for March. Today we're going to be talking gravity. So I personally am very excited about this one as a long-time gravity nerd. It's a great paper and we'll hear more about it in a second. The title of the session is Staggered Difference in Differences in Gravity Settings, Revisiting the Effects of Trade Agreements. So one thing I like about it is that it's got a technical aspect, that is gravity modeling. It's also got a policy aspect. What do we know about the effects of trade agreements? Before we get started, let me say two words about the Trade Policy Research Forum. My name is Ben Shepherd. I'm a co-founder with my colleague Hannah Norberg, who's also on screen. We started the forum in 2020 as an online community for everyone involved in trade policy, that is economists, lawyers, political scientists, policy specialists, and practitioners. So we're all about, as you can tell from our logo, building bridges. One bridge that we want to build is between research and practice, so that those of us doing policy work can become familiar with the latest techniques and the best methods for doing our job. We also want to build bridges between the different parts of the trade policy community. As I said, lawyers, economists, political scientists, practitioners, and policy specialists. So that's what we try to do. We want to recreate the atmosphere of a lunchtime seminar that many of us have been familiar with in graduate school, with the difference that we want it to be exclusively nice. So we try to be positive, and we all try to learn something from the experience. And we have always had a really good record of people being constructive and asking good questions as we go through. As the presenters are talking, please feel free to put your questions either in the Zoom Q&A box or into the chat. We will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session. Hannah and I will moderate that. And we'll take your questions and turn them over to both the presenter and the discussant. We have a very active LinkedIn group. About 3,000 people are members of the group. So if you'd like to stay part of the discussion, please find us on LinkedIn. Our presenters are happy to be found on LinkedIn and social media as well, if you'd like to connect with them. And of course, we do have a mailing list. So you can go to our website, www.tprforum.org, to sign up for our mailing list and stay abreast of all of our webinars. So with that, I'll hand over to Hannah to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you so very much, Ben. I'm so excited about this webinar today because it is like super nerdy and super policy, and it's so needed. And so I'm just thrilled to have Anna and Rebecca here. And there are so many of our friends here today on the call too. So before everybody starts, why don't you start warming up a little bit with the chat box and write in where you're coming in from today so that you know where it is when you want to write your question in there, because we always what? Run out of time. So please do that. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our fancy speakers coming in from the bank world today. The Deutsche Bundesbank, we have Arne Nagengast. Is that correct? Yes? Close enough. He's giving me a thumbs up. And Rebecca Freeman from the Bank of England. And I didn't even know that this type of research was being done there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over. I think, Arne, you go first.
Yes, that's right. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see it now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Great. So hello, everyone. It's great to be here. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Hannah and Ben, for giving me the opportunity to present our work. And I would also like to thank Rebecca for agreeing to discuss our paper. So the title of our paper is Staggered Difference in Differences in Gravity Settings, Revisiting the Effects of Trade Agreements, which is joint work with Yoto Yoto from Drexel University. And before I begin, let me briefly say that the usual disclaimer applies and that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily coincide with the views of the Bundesbank or the Euro system. Okay, so what is this paper about? So as you all very well know, the gravity equation is the workhorse model of international trade, as well as for foreign direct investment, migration, and other variables. And it has been used to quantify the effects of various determinants of trade flows in tens of thousands of academic and policy applications. And on the theory side, there's been a lot of progress that has generated some clear and valuable guidance with respect to the treatment of country-specific determinants of trade flows, such as the need to use exported time and imported time fixed effects in order to control for the structural multilateral resistance terms and panel gravity models. However, the focus of most gravity papers remains on the estimation of the effects of bilateral trade policies, which are usually characterized by a staggered treatment and adoption, which means that the policy intervention occurs in multiple units in different time periods. Unfortunately, trade theory offers relatively little advice on the specific modeling and identification of the effects of these bilateral trade costs. And against this backdrop, and perhaps not surprisingly, some of the most influential contributions to the gravity literature are methodological applications that have led to improvements in the identification of bilateral trade costs, such as the seminal paper by Sanders Silva and Tenrairu and by Anne Bergstrand. As you're probably also well aware, estimation methods similar to the ones commonly used in the gravity setting have recently come under considerable scrutiny from econometric papers that analyze settings with a staggered DID designs. And the so-called standard two-way fixed effect estimates, or TWFE for short, are potentially severely biased in the presence of treatment effect heterogeneity. For example, due to so-called forbidden comparisons that misuse already treated units in the control group. And as shown by Borussiak and Jaravel and Deschamps-Martin, Daudefeuille, these so-called two-way fixed effect estimates are a weighted sum of the average treatment effects in each group and time period, with weights that might in extreme cases even be negative. And as a consequence, these TWFE regressions may not even identify a convex combination of treatment effects. That is, the TWFE coefficient may be negative, even though all individual treatment effects are positive. And in response to that, a wide range of heterogeneity robust DID estimators have been proposed in the recent literature. And in particular, Wooldridge proposes a simple solution. His extended two-way fixed effect estimator, or ETWFE for short, maintains the general structure of the basic TWFE regression, but it allows for treatment effect heterogeneity by additionally introducing suitable cohort year interactions and thereby avoiding comparisons with already treated units. And one of the advantages of this approach, apart from its simplicity, is that it readily generalizes to the estimation of nonlinear models, such as the ones that are commonly used in the gravity setting. Okay, so in the following, let me briefly summarize the main contributions of our paper, which also serve as an outline for the remainder of the presentation. So first, on the methodology side, we adapt the NEST, the new heterogeneity robust staggered difference in difference methods within an empirical panel gravity model, which also takes into account the best estimation practices from the trade gravity literature. Second, with regard to the main result, we estimate the effect of RTAs on trade and provide results at the aggregate event time and cohort level. And in addition, we compute the implicit weights of the OLS TWFE estimator to better understand the differences between the commonly used approach and the extended 2WFE estimator. And finally, we also demonstrate the robustness of our results and the applicability of our methods in different settings by performing a range of additional estimations. Okay, so before delving into all the technical details, let me give you a quick preview of the main result. So the figure plots the evolution of RTA estimates from the atheoretical specification of Tinbergen in 1962 until the most recent developments in the gravity literature. And as you can see, the figure suggests that the RTA estimates have been converging toward about 0.17. So this implies that regional trade agreements have led to an increase of about 18% in trade among RTA member countries. And our main result appears last in the figure. And note that it is more than twice as large, implying that RTAs in our sample have led to an increase of about 46% in trade among member countries. And of course, this result is important from a policy perspective, since some recent RTA estimates have been viewed as unrealistically small. And second, from a methodological perspective, the impact of the ETWFE estimator on the RTE estimate is also among the most impactful methodological changes. Okay, so before introducing the extended TWV estimator, let's just very briefly review the current best practices to estimate the gravity model. So to estimate the effect of RTAs on trade flows, the current standard specification would be as in equation 1, where YIJT denotes nominal trade flows between country I and J at time t, including domestic trade flows. The estimation would be performed using the Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood estimator to account for heteroscedasticity and to take advantage of the information contained in zero trade flows. Pi-IT and Chi-JT are exporter-importer year fixed effects, which account for multilateral resistance terms and any other country time determinants. Tau-IJ are directional pair fixed effects, which mitigate endogeneity concerns and control for all asymmetric time invariant trade costs. Theta IIT are intra-trade cross-border year fixed effects, which account for common globalization trends. And beta TWV is the TWV estimate of the effect of RTAs on trade. And lastly, epsilon IGT is just a multiplicative error term, and standard errors are clustered by country pair. Okay, so to make the gravity estimation heterogeneity robust, following Wooldridge 2023, we just simply replace the single indicator variable RTA IJT with this double sum, where country pair IJ belongs to treatment cohort G if the RTA onset was in a particular year G. GGS is just a time-varying treatment indicator equal to 1 in post-treatment years and 0 otherwise, and delta GS captures the cohort year-specific treatment effects that we are interested in. And taking into account the above considerations, our main estimating equation is then simply given by equation 3, and note that it avoids comparisons with already treated units by saturating the respective observations with fixed effects. Okay, so initially we are interested in identifying these cohort time-specific treatment effects, which provide approximate proportional effects of the intervention. And to identify these treatment effects, two assumptions are necessary, versions of which are a feature of all difference and differences estimations. And note also that in the empirical part of the presentation, we will explicitly test these assumptions to provide some evidence on their validity. So first, in words, the no anticipation assumption requires that the potential outcomes prior to treatment are on average and conditional on the fixed effects the same, i.e. that there's no effect of the treatment before its onset. And second, in words, the parallel trends assumption states that the growth in the outcome of the treatment and control group would have been the same in the absence of treatment. That is, growth can flexibly depend on the time-varying covariates X, but not on treatment assignment. And note also that due to the use of the exponential mean function in the estimating equation, the parallel trends assumption is stated in terms of the ratio of means rather than the difference in means as in the linear case. Okay, so the ETWV estimator proposed in Wooldridge initially requires estimation of treatment effects at the very granular level, which is a common feature of many heterogeneity robust EID estimators proposed in the recent literature. However, interest often lies in more aggregated quantities requiring aggregation. So therefore, to arrive at an aggregate treatment effect, a weighted sum of the estimated cohort year-specific treatment effects is computed, where the weights correspond to the number of observations of cohort G in period S relative to the total number of treated observations. And in addition, we also consider two additional aggregation schemes. First, we compute event time-specific treatment effects by averaging over the cohort dimension. And second, we compute cohort-specific treatment effects by averaging over the time dimension. So in the following, let's take a very brief look at the data we use for our empirical analysis, which is all very much standard. So annual bilateral trade flows, domestic and international, and regional trade agreements are from the publicly available structural gravity database of the WTO for the years 1980 to 2016. And as you know, existing RTA datasets usually report the date of the effective entry into force of the RTA as the initial RTA date, while the negotiations and signing of the RTA usually happens already in the years before. And as a result, some trade barriers may start falling and some economic agents may start adjusting in anticipation of the RTA. And based on this and the results in the literature for our main analysis, we assume an RTA onset of RTAs 3 years before their effective entry into force. And our baseline sample consists of 69 countries covering 98% of world exports. And alternatively, we also use a medium sample of 91 countries covering 99% of world exports and a full sample of 229 countries. And for robustness, we draw on the dynamic gravity data set of the United States International Trade Commission for data on some other standard gravity variables, such as distance, contiguity, and so on, which is also publicly available. Okay, this table reports the number of observations for different groups in the data set and gives you an idea of how the RTAs in the data set are distributed over time. And more importantly, it also allows me to introduce some terminology. So in general, a cohort refers to all country pairs with an RTA onset in a particular year. So this could be different RTAs. The observations of the treatment group can be split into two parts. Treated refers to all post-treatment observations of all cohorts, and not yet treated refers to all pre-treatment years of all cohorts. And never treated are essentially all observations of country pairs that did not sign an RTA agreement during the sample period. And note that due to econometric reasons, we exclude country pairs with an RTA onset prior to 1980, which are so-called always treated units. So as discussed, the ETWF estimator requires the parallel trends assumption and the no anticipation assumption to hold. And therefore, we begin by testing these two assumptions. And to this end, we adapt to our setting the methods of Borussiak et al. And specifically, we replace the treatment effects in equation 3 by co-idea specific placebo treatment effects prior to treatment onset and estimate the regression with untreated observations only. And the figure provides evidence against the violation of the identifying assumptions by showing the aggregated placebo effects in event time relative to treatment onset. And as you can see, the pre-treatment coefficients are all close to 0, and the joint hypothesis test is also insignificant. Therefore, we conclude that there are no signs for significant pre-trends in our setting, and then we continue with the main analysis. So our main estimate are reported in the table on the slide. So the TWFE, the conventional RTA estimate, is in column 1, which is positive and statistically significant, implying an increase in the bilateral trade between member countries of about 18%, in line with the previous literature. And the extended 2WFE estimate is in column 2. It's also positive and statistically significant as expected. However, as I said before, it is significantly larger as compared to the corresponding TWFE result from column 1, implying an increase in bilateral trade between member countries of about 46%. And the remaining columns in the table are for alternative samples, and they show a similar pattern of results. So next, we complement the average RTA estimates from before with cohort and event-specific effects. So the first figure on on the left shows a standard event study results, where you see, how the effect changes over time, over years, in light color, and the corresponding ETWFE results in dark color. And two main results stand out. First, the TWFE estimates are small in each period. And this is similar to the smaller average RTA effects from the static TWFE estimator from the table before. And second, according to our dynamic TWFE estimates, the impact of RTAs is exhausted relatively fast, about 6 years after their initial effects are detected. And the ETWFE estimates, on the other hand, appear to keep growing slowly but monotonically for more than 15 years after the initial impact of RTAs. The second figure on the right zooms in on the cohort heterogeneity, and it shows average cohort-specific treatment effects. And as you can see, there's substantial heterogeneity across treatment cohorts. RTAs with an onset in the 1980s have positive effects, but mostly lower than the average RTA estimates from the previous slide. And the effects of RTAs with an onset in the 1990s are largest, mostly above average, while the cohorts after 2000 on average do not show significant effects. And of course, with this methodology, one can also look at event study effects by cohort, which also show the expected pattern. Okay, so this slide provides some evidence on the source of the bias of the conventional TWFE estimator. And to do so, we focus on OLS, for which analytical decomposition results exist. And note that in our case, the OLS and the PPML estimates of the TWFE and the ETWFE are relatively similar, such that the OLS decomposition results are likely informative about the PPML estimates. So more specifically, we follow the methodology, the decomposition results by the Chers-Martin, Dautefeuille, 2020, to compute the implicit weights attached by the OLS TWFE estimator to individual cohort year cells. And by construction, the OLS TWFE estimate equals the weighted sum of the cohort year effects times those implicit weights. And the results are presented in the two figures, where we report the weights used in the computation of the aggregate effects of the ETWFE in dark color, along with the implicit weights attached by the OLS TWFE estimator to cohort year cells in light color. And the figure on the left shows the results aggregated by event time. And as you can see, the TWFE seems to substantially overweight treatment effects shortly after treatment onset, which tend to be small, and to substantially underweight treatment effects further away from treatment onset, which tend to be large due to these maturation effects that you've seen in the previous slide. Similarly, the figure on the right shows the results aggregated by cohort. And from this perspective, the TWFE estimator overweights late treated cohorts with small effects and underweights early treated cohorts with large effects. And finally, note that while some negative weights are present in our setting, they do not seem to play an important role for driving the differences between the two estimates. Rather, the TWFE estimate is biased downward by putting larger weights on treatment effects shortly after treatment onset and on late cohorts, which are associated with small treatment effects. So in the paper, we also include a comprehensive assessment of the robustness of our results along 4 dimensions. Let me just briefly summarize the sensitivity test without going into all the details. So first, we check the robustness of our results with regard to the degree of the heterogeneity of the estimator. In particular, we limit heterogeneity of time heterogeneity or cohort heterogeneity, and we also consider a specification with even more heterogeneity, as well as an imputation estimator that provides noisy estimates of the effects of individual agreements by year. Second, we also look at potential incidental parameter problems, which may arise in nonlinear models with fixed effects in a Monte Carlo simulation following Whiteman-Zilkin. And we also consider a split panel jackknife for bias correction. Third, we experiment with alternative DID specifications to obtain additional estimates of the effects of RTAs. In particular, we limit the control group to never treated or not yet treated observations. We omit anticipation periods. We include interactions with treatment and gravity covariates. And we also consider alternative weighting schemes of the cohort year effects. Fourth, we check the robustness of our findings with regards to different gravity specifications. In particular, we use OLS instead of PPML. We use 5-year interval data. We omit domestic trade flows, and we also consider alternative clusterings of the standard errors. But overall, all these alternative specifications leave the estimates mostly unchanged in terms of sign and significance, and the ETWFE estimates are always substantially larger than the TWFE estimates. So with that, let me briefly summarize and conclude. So in this paper, we adapt and nest the new heterogeneity robust staggered difference and difference methods within an empirical gravity model. With regards to the aggregate results, the ETWFE estimator delivers RTA estimates that are significantly larger and more long-lasting than the corresponding estimates that are based on the current methods from the gravity literature. In computing the implicit weights attached by the OLS TWFE to individual cohort year effects suggests that the TWFE is biased downward by putting larger weights on short-run effects and those of late cohorts, which are both associated with smaller treatment effects. And finally, not least due to its ease of applicability, we expect the ETWFE estimator to have significant implications for the estimates of other policies that have been studied with the gravity model, such as economic sanctions, membership in GATT and WTO, currency unions, and so on. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your question and to the discussion by Rebecca.
Okay, thanks, Arne. That was a really great presentation. It's technical material, and we asked you to focus on intuition and understanding and policy. And you've done that, I've got to say, particularly well. So I think it sets the ground really nicely for a great discussion. So Rebecca, let me hand the floor over to you to get us rolling.
Great. So let me share my screen here. And I would like to thank you as well, Hannah and Ben, for the invitation to be here today. Sorry, I'm just, there we go. All right, can you see my screen? Put it in full screen mode. Okay, great. Perfect. So why don't I just jump straight in, since we have just 10 minutes. And before kind of jumping into my main comments, I'm just going to kind of provide a summary of the paper. And so effectively what this paper is doing, it's a methods paper, is it's nesting the extended two-way fixed effect estimator for staggered differences within the structural gravity model. And then it has a very important and neat policy implication by asking, with this estimation setting, what is the impact of regional trade agreements or RTAs on bilateral trade? But of course, as we've just learned from the presentation, these methods are applicable to estimating other policy variables, not only for bilateral trade flows, but other gravity model settings, for example, trade and migration, or else FDI flows as well. So without going into all of the advancements over the past kind of 60 years of gravity literature, I'm just going to I put at the top of the slide the state-of-the-art gravity equation that Arne showed on one of his first slides. So this is the standard gravity equation that takes advantage of all of the advances in gravity literature to date, so including international flows, bilateral fixed effects, country time, fixed effects on the importer-exporter side, etc. And so as the paper points out, there's still an outstanding issue, despite all of the advancements that have been made since the 1960s. And that's that this RTA term, which varies at the country pair time level, is going to occur in the multiple units in different time periods. And so, as was explained in the presentation, the current best practices in the literature are ignoring the possibility that RTAs might have heterogeneous effects on trade across agreement pairs and over time. And also, kind of more importantly, as is argued in the paper, this delta term might be biased downwards. And so that is because of two reasons. The second one is what turns out to be more prevalent in the paper, which is that the standard two-way fixed effect estimator is overweighting the RTA treatment effect shortly after the onset of the agreement, and is underweighting that treatment effect further from the onset. But as Arne discussed, the effect of RTAs actually comes into effect over multiple years. In fact, they show 15 or so years in the paper. The second reason, which is the one that I've put in bullet point number 1, is that there's also cases where units that were already treated in early periods end up getting included in the control group in later periods. And so that can cause bias because the two-way fixed effect estimates are a weighted sum of average treatment effects on the treated in each individual group in each time period. And some of those weights might be negative. So when that's the case, we get this negative bias. So why hasn't this been addressed to date? Effectively, we're still in need of new methods, and there's always room for improvements. And so the treatments of non-linear differences and differences estimates have been limited in these non-linear settings, such as PPML, even though a lot of advancements have been made for linear models. So, and again, we want to be using PPML because that allows us to account for heteroscedasticity of trade flows. It allows us to account for the fact that there's also zero trade flow between country pairs. And these things have been shown to be very important to include in gravity models. So what do the authors do about it? Effectively, they capitalize on very recent advancements in the difference in differences literature. So Wooldridge 2023. And what they do is they nest this extended two-way fixed effects, or ETWE, estimator into the state-of-the-art gravity model. And so what this estimator does is it introduces cohort and year interactions to allow for treatment effect heterogeneity. So again, at the top of the slide here, I've just repeated the standard state-of-the-art gravity equation. And effectively what the authors are doing is they're swapping this RTA term with the ETWE estimator. And so this delta term is what we're interested in. So as explained in the paper, the delta 1990-1990 is capturing the treatment effect of all RTAs that were signed in 1990 on trade in the first year. If we have delta 1990-1991, that's capturing the treatment effect of all RTAs signed in 1990 on trade in the second year. And then what they're going to do is take the weighted sum of these estimated cohort time specific treatment effects, giving an equal weight to all post-treatment effects. And they do robustness on the weights in their section where they kind of explore the robustness of results. And the main innovation of the paper and of this method and applying this method in the gravity setting is that it avoids comparisons with the already treated units by saturating the respective observations with fixed effects. So this is the same figure. I've taken it from the paper that was shown. And effectively, the headline finding or main finding is that when the authors take account of all of those important advancements in the gravity literature, which are showed in the kind of light gray point estimates over the past 6 decades, they find that RTA estimates are still likely to be biased downward, and that bias can be by more than 50%. So kind of taking a step back from a policy setting, this actually has really significant implications because it's telling us that the impact of RTAs could be credited with boosting trade by much more than has been conventionally thought by policymakers and academics and practitioners alike. So they do a series of kind of other robustness checks and other exercises, which Arne also discussed. And I'm not going to go into them in so much detail, except to say that there's really quite a lot of robustness around this. And that was very refreshing to see. Instead, I'm going to focus on kind of some of the most notable results and kind of delve into these and pose some questions. So 2 of them I think are quite policy relevant. So the first is that in the event study, we see that the extended two-way fixed effects results point to longer lasting RTA effects over time. So they find, the authors find that the impact of RTAs have been growing for more than 15 years after the onset of an RTA versus somewhere between 6 and 10 years, which is what the gravity literature has been telling us to date. And so the implication of this is that RTA effects might phase in more gradually than we previously thought. And I think that's a really important takeaway in terms of how we think about trade agreements and their effect on international trade. The other policy relevant finding that I'm going to come back to in the next slide is about deep trade agreements. And what the authors find in terms of time effects is that by cohort, there's no significant effect of trade agreements for any of the agreements signed post-2000. And the reason that I found this result particularly interesting is that agreements have gotten deeper over time. And so in the paper, the authors try to reconcile this by saying that many countries are members of the WTO. When you're a member of the WTO, you adhere to MFN tariffs, and tariffs have gotten lower over time, and so potentially the effects of RTAs have been saturated. So I thought that was a very interesting puzzle, and I'm going to come back to it. Just before doing that, one other kind of methods point is that the extended two-way fixed effect estimate decreases in magnitude as additional countries are added to the sample. So we could see that actually in the table 1 that was shown in the presentation just a few minutes ago, that as the sample went from small to medium to large, the extended two-way fixed effect estimate, point estimate, decreases. And that's actually not the case for the standard estimate, depending on a country sample. And so the author's explanation for that is that there's smaller treatment effects for additional country pairs that get added to the sample. It's not driven by the core sample of countries. But I thought that that was quite interesting. So I'm just going to conclude in the remaining few minutes with kind of throwing out 3 comments and questions. And the first is about general equilibrium. So the authors do allude to this kind of in the beginning part of the paper, but I would just like to ask kind of how would you go about estimating the full endowment GE effects in this current setting, for example, compared to more traditional settings like the standard two-way fixed effect estimator. And I think that this definitely should be possible, but general equilibrium is definitely something that is very important from a policy perspective and many applications overall. And so kind of as a follow-up to this work, or kind of to make the application even more widely adopted by the literature and policy circles, it would be good to kind of give an example of that, since you've already done the groundwork in the reduced form. The second is about the applications, and Arne discussed quite thoroughly the required identifying assumptions that are required for the two-way fixed effect estimator to hold. In particular, no anticipation and no parallel trends. And so in the current setting, what the authors do is they say to account for no anticipation, that the onset of an RTA, they count that as 3 years prior to the entry into force of the agreement. And we know from the trade literature that there are anticipation effects of trade agreements. They come to this 3 years kind of cut off in a very sensible way, drawing upon literature and other estimates. But my question is, for this estimator to be used in other applications, is this really likely to hold for other policy settings? And I can think of a few examples where it might be challenging. So, for example, if we wanted to apply this to gravity migration models, for example, one practitioner could be interested, for example, in freedom of movement agreements. So movements that allow individuals to migrate from one country to another in order to seek employment opportunities. And I was thinking, when this is the case, and it's shown that when this is the case, there could be differences in anticipation of this agreement depending on how close country pairs are to one another. For example, the individual resources of migrants to potentially scope out job opportunities in a foreign country before the actual freedom of movement agreement comes into force, allowing them to kind of get their foot on the ground. And so kind of to state that in a different way, the provisions of those types of agreements might be phased in over different periods of time, and anticipation might vary depending on the country pair in question. Also, for applications to foreign direct investment and potentially trade as well, one might think of bilateral investment treaties and kind of questions around the anticipation effects of those. And then let me just end with kind of this puzzle that I referred to about kind of the gravity experiments and deep trade agreements. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the paper puts out a puzzle. So we know from the literature, and the paper confirms, that deeper trade agreements give a bigger boost to trade. We also know that trade agreements have gotten deeper over time, but the extended two-way fixed effect estimates are lower for the later cohorts. So my first question is that when exploring this, the authors define deep trade agreements by just looking at the median number of provisions, so those that address tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And if a country pair, or if an agreement has more than the median, then they have a deep agreement. If they have less than the median, then they have a shallow agreement. But potentially one could go a little bit further there and look at, for example, the coverage ratio. So within an agreement, how many clauses are actually enforced? And on top of that, I wonder whether this is a story of provision heterogeneity. So within the databases that look at deep trade agreements, we know that some of the provisions and clauses are covered by what's mandated by the WTO. So that's what's called WTO+. And some provisions go beyond what's mandated by the WTO, or WTOX. And I wonder if it would be worth exploring whether that result is driven by WTO+ or kind of core provisions versus non-core provisions. And if it really is a tariff story, and the WTO+ mandated provisions are what count, what does that actually say about the need to deepen agreements in order to include reductions in non-tariff barriers? So I will end with this kind of picture on the screen here, which basically is showing on the left-hand side, making the point that the number of pairs, of country pairs with a deep trade agreement have increased over time, and the number of clauses that have entered into those agreements have increased over time. But on the right-hand side, as shown in the dark blue bars, we see that the trade policy component of those deep trade agreements actually remains the same. So kind of do these non-trade policy areas like political dialogue and human rights and data protection or innovation policies, all things which are very important, is that what's kind of causing this insignificant effect? So I will stop here, and thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was a really great discussion and a nice slide to end on too. I think there's some really interesting policy meat in this area. So I think you raised some really interesting points. Let me just hand it back to Arne to see if there's anything that he'd like to pick up specifically before we go into general Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for the very nice discussion and also great summary as well, providing some additional intuition. I think this was probably quite helpful for many people. Yeah, I mean, you raised three really great points. Let me just try to say a few words on some of the aspects that you raised. So I think your first point was about the general equilibrium effects of trade agreements in the setting, and so I think we just briefly alluded to this in the main paper, since I think the problem is essentially the same as for the TWV estimate. I think Yoto and co-authors have a nice paper on this. I think in World Economy, it's Anderson et al. 2018, where they essentially provide a procedure of how you can sort of iteratively back out the general equilibrium effects of updating the multilateral resistance terms and so on and so forth. And we think that this can also be applied in the setting. So I think in theory it should be possible to compute this in the setting as well. Your second point I found was really interesting. I hadn't thought about this, that you have sort of country-specific anticipation effects. So that's quite a nice one. So I think in general, I don't know. I mean, in general, this is a comment that would apply to the traditional methods as well. I mean, it's not something that's specific to the extended two-way fixed estimator. I'm not really sure what a nice way would be to address this. If you have some knowledge of how these anticipation effects are distributed, then I think there's a way to address this by shifting the effects forward in time, like we did, or Woolridge, for example, also suggests to leave out these anticipation periods, and we do a robustness check in our paper on this as well. But I think you need some sort of information how the anticipation effects are distributed by country to address this. But I thought this was quite an interesting point. And finally, I mean, this the third point was about the declining effects of cohorts over time and the relation to deep trade agreements. I think this is, as you pointed out, I think this is probably one of the largest puzzles that sort of comes out of our paper, and I'm sure should be addressed in the future. It wasn't really the focus of our paper, so that we didn't go into more details than was necessary, I would say. So maybe first of all, let me point out that there are also some composition effects. So the later cohorts, they benefit from fewer of those long-term effects of trade agreements. So if they phase in, then in particular the ones that were signed at the very end, I mean, they don't yet benefit from these phasing in effects. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison. What you'd have to do is really check, the same duration for the earlier agreements as well. So there's some composition effects there. We also looked, I mean, drilling down more into the deep trade agreements, I think is a very valuable, avenue of future research, and we just sort of scratched at the surface in the robustness checks and did a very, very coarse robustness, as you pointed out, on the sort of the median number of provisions. And of course, you can do much more on the provision heterogeneity over time and use more sophisticated measures. And I think that's a very, very good avenue for future research and drilling down more and understanding this phenomenon better, and to learn really what's causing this decline that we find in the effectiveness of trade agreements over time, what can be done about it, and what role deep trade agreements could possibly play. So yeah, no, thank you very much for the great discussion.
Okay, thanks. Let's maybe go into a bit of Q&A. We've had a few that have come up in the Q&A box and a couple of others in chat. A mix of technical and non-technical. Let me start maybe with a couple of technical points, and then we can get into the policy afterwards. So Arne, there was a question from a colleague of mine in a country that I won't name, but it's a country that made a major trade policy decision in 2016. And since then has been signing a very large number of trade agreements with a range of partners around the world. So for this hypothetical country, how do you deal with the fact that it might sign more than one trade agreement in a year? So when you're defining cohorts, what happens with countries that are treated multiple times?
So I mean, in the current setting, what would happen is that they're all lumped into one cohort, and the estimate essentially just estimates the average effect across these agreements. But I think Wooldridge has quite a nice equivalence result. So there's this imputation estimator, which estimates these effects at the individual agreement times year level. So that's what you mentioned essentially. And Wooldridge shows that, you know, if you do this at the individual level and then compute the effect, the mean effect at the cohort level, then essentially it's equivalent. So you don't necessarily need to start off computing this at the agreement level. Having said this, in the more sort of complicated setting that we use with the country year fixed effects, this equivalence no longer holds. So we all have something like a robustness check on this along these lines in the paper as well. But the effects are still relatively similar. But if you're really concerned about this and interested in these individual agreement effects, then it would be better to use a sort of imputation estimator, which can also be used with PPML, and you receive, I have to say, sort of noisy, perhaps not consistent estimates of the individual agreements, but you can do that as well.
Interesting, because there is a literature out there. It's a small literature looking at heterogeneity in the effects of individual agreements. But I think from a policy perspective, and again, my colleague who posted the question, I think has this in mind. What do we do with agreements that have different effects? So I think you've given us a good answer to that. Let me ask, for people who are sitting at home watching this and thinking, I want to be able to do this. This is a great method. I think it would help me answer a question that I've been working on. What's the situation going to be with making code available, replication packages, all that sort of stuff?
The paper is currently conditionally accepted at the journal, and once it's unconditionally accepted, then we'll release the replication package of the paper, and then everyone can use the command. We're currently also working on a even more user-friendly version of the command that everyone can use, which we hope to release in the next month as well for Stata.
Fantastic. So for people out there, so I admitted to being a gravity nerd at the beginning of the session. There are plenty of gravity nerds on the call. So keep an eye out for the package, because then you can replicate all of this and you can use it in your own work. I think Arne gave a few examples of some other policy questions where this might be a really useful kind of technique, and I'm sure there's tons more. Rebecca, let me maybe go over to you. There's a policy question that's come up, which I kind of like. It's someone asking, if I'm sitting in a Ministry of Trade and someone comes along and asks me, what has the effect of our trade agreements been over the last decade? How do I explain this result to them? And, I know that you work in a policy setting. How do I explain the results that the action that they're finding in the paper in trade agreements is in the 1990s, and then as we get towards the end of the sample, the effects are dissipating? I know there was mention of, the lack of time for these dynamic effects, these phase-ins to take place, but how also do we try and explain this to people? I liked the graph that you put up about core provisions and non-core provisions. And I was just wondering if you could take us a bit further in your thinking on that.
Yeah, so I think as also Arne was discussing the cohorts and making that point that the agreements in the later periods have not had the same time to exhibit maturation effects, that's actually a really important point to take into account. I potentially underappreciated that in the discussion as well. So it might be interesting, for example, to look at like the 2000 cohort where you would have the full 16 years of data, because in the paper they show effectively that these maturation effects phase in over a 15-year period. So one could compare like the 1990 cohort and the 2000 cohort and look at that. But I think in terms of like of the deep trade agreement point specifically, where I would be interested in going, and if I were talking to a Ministry of Foreign Trade or sitting in kind of a policy, a trade policy institution, it would be really kind of trying to unpack the different aspects of trade, and so and how trade agreements play into that. And so the literature to date and the evidence to date has very, very robust evidence that decreases in tariffs boost international trade amongst country pairs. And I think where the literature is a little bit lacking is kind of unpacking what the deep trade agreements add on top of that. And so we know, and this is actually very hard to do, because when trade agreements and deep trade agreements come into force, many of the provisions come into force simultaneously. And so there's a lot of multicollinearity amongst these different provision categories, and it's hard to disentangle them from one another. And so that's why I kind of think that it would be interesting, kind of from the policy perspective, to look at like core versus non-core provisions, or those which are really focused more around kind of, let's say, more traditional trade liberalizations versus other things like intellectual property rights or regulations and standards, and kind of tease out the differences between those. Also with the knowledge that some of those might be kind of not trade creating. So if something's meant to be a protection, like higher standards, which I think many countries will agree that they want, that could actually impede trade flows, because it would cause countries that potentially send products to another country to like boost the standards of their own products. So I think that's how I would kind of go about it. And I wouldn't say that, you know, signing an agreement is in later periods is a moot point and that it's not worth it, because it's always better to have more integration, more cooperation, keeping in mind that here we're also looking at bilateral trade flows, but we can unpack this by looking at global value chains and trade in intermediate goods versus trade in final goods. And there's a large kind of literature going in that direction as well, and kind of not just ending at that headline message, but really trying to kind of explore the nuances within it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, like any really good paper, this one gives us some answers to some really important questions, but it also raises a bunch of questions that people can then go out and answer. I just wanted to plug the fact, from a data perspective, we're talking about deep trade agreements. Of course, there are two great data sources on the structure of trade agreements. One is the World Bank Deep Trade Agreements database. The other is the DESTA Design of Trade Agreements database. And these allow you really to get into the nitty-gritty, as Rebecca was just doing, of what sort of provisions are in the agreement, what chapters does it have, are they legally enforceable, how do they relate to WTO disciplines, all this sort of thing. So I think there's a ton of work for people to do out there. My impression of those data sources is that actually we have a ton of data that's just not exploited at the moment. We don't really know how to deal with this problem that Rebecca mentioned, that types of provisions tend to go together. They tend to be grouped together. And so identifying the effect of an individual type of provision is very, very difficult. And I think there have been some attempts to do that. You know, Tom Zilk and co-authors have a nice paper where they use machine learning to try and do some of this. But I think there's a lot more work to do there. So that's I think a really good point. Let me just go back to Arne. On a technical level, I mean, I know the motivation for the paper is causal inference, okay, that we want to sort of combine what we've got from the causal inference literature with structural gravity, and it makes a lot of sense to me. But we've had two questions about the role of endogeneity, because there's this whole literature out there Bayer and Bergstrand and other authors have written on the endogeneity of trade agreements, that if two countries have got a very strong trade relationship, they're more likely to sign a trade agreement. Now, can you tell us how your method deals with that, and then whether or not, when we have a method like yours, there's still a need to think about things like instrumental variables and these other sort of methods that we have for dealing with these kinds of concerns?
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in general, I think different methods sort of, can identify the effect under the assumptions that I stated. The point that you were alluding to was, if countries trade a lot with each other, then potentially that when they sign an agreement, then we kind of confound the effect that they traded more beforehand with the trade creating effect afterwards. But I think at least that concern you can sort of remedy by looking at the parallel trends, which we saw. We really see no differences in pre-trends in these two countries. What different methods cannot do, of course, is if there's another shock coming in at the exact same time as the trade agreement, then you might, of course, confound it with the effect of the trade agreement. So, but I think there's that's something difference methods cannot do, and also I think most other methods in the causal inference literature cannot do. I think if you have these time varying shocks, then it's very difficult to tell these effects apart.
Yep, absolutely. Hannah, let me hand over to you. What would you like to get into the conversation?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm sorry, it's super loud. Can you still hear me? Is it all
we
right?
can hear you, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, a couple of comments. First, on the country that might have, the country that wasn't named, I'm assuming that you would have to pull it out of 27 cohorts too. Perhaps. So that would be an interesting observation to see, once that the dust has settled there in about 5 or 15 years then. And then I would also like to congratulate Rebecca on a fantastic presentation, which I hope we could have every single time, right? So like pulling out the policy implications, I just love that. So great job, both of you. Arne, for you, now that you have done all this work, what is it that you wish that somebody else would run with? Now that you have all the data package and you've worked through all the data and all these thoughts that you have, for the people who are out there hungry and ambitious and want to, join the race with you, what would you propose that they bite into?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the comment on maybe first on the country that is not to be named. Is not in our, is the event that you alluded to is not in our sample anymore, because we only look at data until 2016. But yeah, certainly I think exit from trade agreements is also something it rarely occurs, but I think it's also an interesting event to look at for sure. And yeah, also thank you for your question about potential future work. I think the most interesting Rebecca has already alluded to. I think she's given great pointers of what could potentially be done in the future. I think this would definitely be I think highest on the priority list, I would say. On top of that, I think it would also be interesting to reevaluate these, other policy interventions that I already highlighted a little in the presentation. I mean, there's lots of stuff also on FDI flows or migration policies, also other trade-related events that one could look at. I think these are all valuable things to do and to reevaluate with the new methods.
Can I add one to that list, because someone's just put it in the chat, trade and services. I'm also a services nerd, and I'm assuming your database covers trade and goods, as is typical. With services, we've got all sorts of data issues, but I think trying to tease this out for services would be really interesting, because one of the big differences between the older trade agreements and the newer trade agreements is their coverage of services. Yet there is this whole question about how binding the disciplines in trade agreements actually are, given the level of applied policies. So I think you've given us some really great ideas for research there. I think, you know, when the package comes out, there are definitely going to be people in the audience who are racing off to their computers to try it out and to work with it. So, you know, it's a really nice piece of research. There's also a public good aspect to it, which we definitely appreciate. In our context, it'll be freely available. As you said, the publication should be out soon, so we look forward to seeing that. Let me thank Arne, our presenter, and Rebecca, our discussant. To me, this is exactly what we want to do with the Trade Policy Research Forum. It's a great piece of research. It's brand new, and we've managed to discuss it in a way that is not too technical, and gets to some of the policy questions that are involved. So we had really very high quality discussion today. And so I greatly appreciate that. Before we leave, let me advertise our next session, which is on April 18th. We're going to have Emilio Lamanaka, who will be speaking to us. Let me just share my screen. There we go. She'll be speaking to us on trade and environmental outcomes of environmental related technical measures. So we had one of her co-authors present a couple of months ago. This is kind of the second stage of that work. So going from a kind of general trade policy context, what are we doing with trade agreements? How do we estimate the effects? To a very specific context of what are these particular measures looking at. So as usual, that'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern time. Again, please join us on our LinkedIn group. Please go to the website, tprforum.org, where you can sign up for the mailing list. With our presenters' permission, we'll also try and post their PowerPoints there, and we'll post a link to the recording of this webinar. So thank you very much to our presenters. Thanks very much to my co-founder and co-host, Hannah. And thanks to everyone for attending. I think that was a really great session, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Awesome work, everybody. Thank you so much. See you next time. And the everything will be on the website. So don't worry if you didn't hear anything. Everything will get there for Encores. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Rebecca. Hope to see you back
Thanks,
soon.
Thank you from me
Thank
as
you.
well. Bye.
Bye.